This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. Today on this Thursday's program, we start with K-State Environmental Quality Extension Specialist, Peter Tomlinson. He speaks on water quality and its significance across the state of Kansas. Also ahead, Marsha Boswell, the Vice President of Communications at the Kansas Wheat Commission, provides our last wheat harvest update of the season and describes it overall this year as variable. We end with this week's horticulture piece from K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd. He discusses options for controlling Japanese beetles and squash bugs. That and more awaits us ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now with Peter Tomlinson. He is an environmental quality extension specialist here in the agronomy department at K-State. But we're going to be talking about, like I said, water quality, which is a topic of discussion that you've been covering this week as well.
It is one of the topics I'm talking about at our summer field school for crop consultants. And, water quality, it's a concern across the state of Kansas. We look at many of our lakes and reservoirs. They have multiple uses. Some are used for drinking water, and we certainly want that to be a clean source of drinking water that minimizes the cost of water treatment. Others are used for flood control. They were all designed with an intended purpose, and we need to maximize their life. And if we look at across the state, sedimentation and excess nutrients in our reservoirs continue to be a major concern. It was just a few years ago that John Redmond Reservoir, which provides cooling water for Wolf Creek Nuclear Operating Station, portions of that were dredged at a significant cost to the state. So if we can work to keep that sediment out of our lakes and reservoirs, and we switch gears and think about, sediment's what's in the bottom of the lake, but that's topsoil, which has a value in our agricultural lands. Let's find ways and opportunities to keep that in the field where it is of maximum benefit and out of our lakes and reservoirs. And then if we look from the nutrient standpoint, we continue to see harmful algal blooms across the state, and that's indicative of high nutrient loads in our lakes and reservoirs, which many of our rural communities depend on that recreation income from those lakes and reservoirs in the summer. And, if that lake is closed, let's say on 4th of July weekend that just happened a week ago, that may be a significant portion of that town's income for the year. And so those nutrients have a cost. Let's maximize their value and keep them where they belong in our fields and out of our lakes and reservoirs. To that end, we've got a number of tried and true best management practices that K-State has tested and evaluated over the years. Certainly adding vegetated buffer strips along the bottom edge of fields does a good job. Converting from conventional tillage to no-till. If we can stabilize that soil, provide some protection to it, we can reduce that sediment load that's leaving our fields. Making sure that we're maintaining terraces, whether those are draining through a tile outlet or a grassed waterway or blind terrace outlet. We've just got to make sure that we're maintaining those terraces. And, that's a challenge as farm machinery gets larger. Some of the older designs were fairly narrow terraces, and that's hard to maneuver machinery through. But there's still value to terraces. I'm convinced that structural practices such as terraces are the backbone of conservation and keeping that soil and nutrients where it belongs. We can add things such as cover crops and residue management and all of that on top of those, but at bare minimum, we need those structural practices to really be effective. As we think about conservation practices, whether it's in no-till and conventional tilled ground, a lot of the same things work in both of those. Certainly the structural practices come into play in both of those. In the no-till, we're going to have a greater opportunity to maintain residue on that soil surface. But there's an opportunity there. A conventional tilled producer can utilize cover crops and may actually, help to reduce sediment more than when that's added into a no-till system. Certainly, cover crops are effective in a no-till system at reducing sediment. We'll talk a little bit more about some data that we've got from a project here in Manhattan.
There's not just one way of going about ensuring water quality across the state. The options are really limitless in terms of how extensive a producer wants to be about their options. So when we're thinking about this, if a producer's just wanting to dip their toes in the water, per se, here, and wanting to just get started, where's the best first step to really start?
I think that best first step is look at your fields. Do you have, most of our fields across Kansas have some legacy conservation, structural conservation practice, such as terraces in those fields. Look at those. Is there some low-cost maintenance, such as plowing the terrace channel to build that terrace up? Can we do some of those low-cost options to just enhance the conservation practices and maintain the lifespan of those conservation practices? Thinking about the nutrient side, really paying attention to your soil fertility plan, making sure that you're not over-applying nitrogen and phosphorus. One, that's money out of a producer's pocket if they're over-applying, but, that has downstream impacts. And so, really paying attention to one's soil fertility program in conjunction with those structural practices is where I'd recommend somebody begin.
You touched on this earlier, but some recent research has been done here at K-State. So let's talk about that a little bit.
So in about 2014, we started the Kansas Agricultural Watershed Field Laboratory. This project is led by Dr. Nathan Nelson in the agronomy department, one of our soil fertility faculty, along with a number of other faculty members, and I'm part of the team involved in that project. But we've got 18 approximately 1 acre watersheds, all have flumes and automated samplers so that we can collect runoff from each of those small watersheds. Think about it as a small field. And so in this project, when we first started, we wanted to really focus around phosphorus placement. And so we've got a no-P control plot that we've not added any phosphorus fertilizer. And then in the first 5 years, we had 2 build and maintain treatments. One that was fall broadcast, and the other that was spring banded with either the corn or soybean crop. And then over the top of that hat, we've got, in each of those treatments, we've got either cover crops or no cover crops. So the question was, are cover crops going to be the silver bullet to help manage phosphorus losses? And from the work, we've been able to confirm that cover crops play an important role in reducing sediment. Even in no-till, we've been able to document greater than a 50% reduction in the sediment losses.
Wow.
And if we actually look at it on the tons per acre, it's not as impactful as what we would see in a tillage situation, but it still highlights that they have value from that sediment control standpoint. The other piece of that is it's given us a greater understanding of how cover crops and phosphorus fertilizer interact. One of the things that we started to observe early on, and this follows with some work that was done in the Ohio River Valley, but we started to see pronounced phosphorus stratification. And so we've been observing, in the top 2 inches and even the top inch, increasing soil test phosphorus levels to the point in that top inch now we're over 100 parts per million Mehlich 3. So if we think about that surface as the zone that's most subject to interaction with precipitation, runoff water, if you've got a really high phosphorus concentration there, you're setting yourself up for the potential for phosphorus loss. And we haven't seen a significant difference between the fall broadcast and the spring injected, but we have observed some cover crop effects, and they weren't necessarily what we had expected. We've actually been seeing more dissolved phosphorus in the cover crop treatments. And at first that was kind of puzzling, but as you think about it, if we're controlling sediment and, we've got an enriched surface, we've got pretty saturated soil surfaces saturated with phosphorus, and so as that runoff water and precipitation interacts, it's not surprising that we're seeing some of that be carried off in the runoff water. And so this brought us to, we were approaching the end of 5 years, and research always raises more questions. So what we've done now, and we're just started the third year of this treatment, is we answered our questions around fall broadcast. So we've stayed with the spring injected, but now we've maintained that build and maintain, and really we're in a maintenance program on that now. And then we've took that fall broadcast and converted that to a sufficiency. So what if we manage that with minimal phosphorus inputs? And we're in the third year of that, and our yields have not significantly declined, so we're still using that phosphorus that's in the that we'd built up in the soil profile. I think we're right at that tipping point, and it'll be interesting to see. I think in this next cropping season, we'll need to add some phosphorus back into that. But, we're working to understand for a long time, nitrogen has been, the recommendation is to try to move away from applying it all up front and apply split application throughout the year so that you don't have a large pool of nitrogen sitting out there. And not that I think we'll get to the point of needing to apply phosphorus multiple times throughout the year, but I think we're going to be, particularly in regions where we've got concern about phosphorus levels in surface waters, I think long term we're going to need to look at how much phosphorus we're applying and really try to dial that into what the agronomic need is and find that balance point where we can minimize impacts on water quality and still maintain good crop production.
That was Peter Tomlinson. He is the Environmental Quality Extension Specialist in our Agronomy Department here at K-State, covering water quality. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now for our last wheat harvest update. And to conclude on and summarize really the season that we've had, we have with us Marsha Boswell. She is the Vice President of Communications at the Kansas Wheat Commission. And Marsha, just thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I know you've been super busy for the last month or so.
As have our farmers. It's been a busy month of wheat harvest, and it's pretty much wrapped up at this point.
We were speaking before we went on the air here, but we're about 95% done in the state. Is that correct?
Yes, that's as of July 10th. The National Ag Statistics Service keeps that up to date each week, and so there's a few counties that have some fields left that are wrapping things up. But for the most part, harvest is complete in the state of Kansas.
Wow, wonderful. And from all the different agents that I've been speaking with from K-State across the state that have been sharing with me what harvest has been like, it's really been kind of up in the air depending on what area these people have been located in.
That's true. I think probably the big term for this year's harvest is variability, because depending on where the field was located and how much moisture it received or did not receive over the growing season really had a huge effect on how things yielded. The other thing that had a large effect on that was the crop rotation and whether it was wheat after summer fallow or wheat after corn or continuous or, what that rotation was really affected how the wheat did in terms of yield this year.
Absolutely. And in terms of which ones kind of did better, which ones didn't measure up quite as well, what did we really see?
Well, absolutely. Wheat after summer fallow did better pretty much throughout the whole state, which I think can be, that's what we would assume it would do, but it was really more distinct this year in the differences than some years. Some places, wheat after soybeans was the lowest yielding. And, I should preface that with the lowest yielding was some of the areas in southwest Kansas where it was zeroed out and claimed for insurance because there was really nothing there. There were some places that got close to 300 days, I think, without any measurable moisture.
Wow.
And so there was just no wheat in those areas at all. But the good news is there were other areas that did well, that did get a little bit of moisture, and even some of the areas that got very little moisture, the wheat yielded better than it was expected to do. So I think there were a few farmers that had some good surprises. I think last time we talked about quality a little bit too, and that throughout the whole harvest season, which was just about 4 weeks long from south central, southwest Kansas, where it started, all the way up through north central, northwest Kansas, where it kind of wrapped up in the last week or so. Test weights were excellent, above 60 pounds per bushel. There were some areas where a little bit of rain came in and delayed harvest a few days, and that typically has an effect on test weight, but it didn't seem to drop it too much. So even after the rains, test weights were still coming in at 58 or something like that. So test weights were really good. Protein was at least 12 probably for an average for a lot of areas. Some places we're seeing 13s, 14s, and higher in terms of protein. So it was an excellent protein year. I think that when we find out what that total statewide average is after USDA does some evaluation, we're going to find that it's higher than the last couple of years have been, and hopefully a little bit higher than that, like 12% baseline protein level. So protein test weights were great. Yields, not so much. USDA says that the state yield is 39. Still, they didn't change that in this report that came out this week, but they did change their estimate for the crop, so kind of figured in a little bit more abandonment than they had in their earlier report, but not much. So they're looking at average production this year at 267 million bushels, and that's down from 364 last year.
I was talking to another county agent, their name's slipping my mind right now, unfortunately, but they were saying that we almost got spoiled in the state of Kansas the last several years in terms of yield. We've had some really good seasons, and then to have one that's not measuring up quite as well is a bit disappointing.
It is disappointing, but I think if you look at the varieties we're currently planting and how well they have hung on this year with very little moisture, I think that's just showing that wheat varieties are much improved over the ones that we used to have in the past. I mean, there's a ton of varieties out there, but a lot of them were able to just hang on with very little moisture. And that's because of our wheat breeders that we have, here at K-State, excellent wheat breeders, but also the private breeders as well.
Absolutely. And, we mentioned if we were going to sum up the season in one word, it would be variability. But I think resiliency is another word that might sum it up quite well, too.
Yes, that's true. Wheat is a very resilient crop. I mean, we saw short wheat plants that started making a head before they were, over a foot tall. And we did kind of luck out during grain fill time and have some cooler temperatures at that time. So even the smaller body areas, those grains were able to fill very well, which is, I think, what's giving us that excellent quality this year.
That's the other trend, too, is that you mentioned that quality, while the yields haven't been there, quality has been surprisingly good, which I think producers are extremely thankful for.
Yes, and I think millers and others in the industry are going to have an excellent quality crop to purchase from.
And speaking of others in those industries, in terms of storage that we've seen as a result of harvest, what has that process really looked like this year across the state?
Well, I think with fewer bushels, storage hasn't been a huge problem. We haven't seen, a lot of export movement, although that started to open up a little bit. But I think that, as we get closer to fall harvest, there will be a need to be moving wheat and making room for those fall crops. But right now, we're just happy to have the wheat crop in the bin.
Absolutely. And I heard from a few different areas that short wheat was really something that was a theme this year. Can you speak on that?
Yes, the wheat pretty much throughout the state was shorter than it typically is. Some of the farmers that have no-till practices that want to keep that stubble in place to catch the moisture and catch the snows and protect that soil over the non-growing season are having a harder time because there's just not as much residue left behind. Mm-hmm. So that could affect how the next crop that's planted in these areas does, how much moisture there is from upcoming moisture events. So that's affecting the future as well. I also wanted to mention that with some of the seeds that may be left behind in that stubble or in those fields, we want to encourage farmers to control all of that volunteer wheat as they're going into planting season and make sure that it is completely dead 2 weeks prior to planting to control issues like wheat streak mosaic virus, which is carried through that volunteer wheat and other grassy weeds. So that's just really important as we go into next year as well. We were really fortunate this year. We didn't have a lot of disease problems. I think the drought and the dry temperatures kept rust out of the state for the most part. And let's just want to encourage people to do what they can to prevent some of those diseases next year as well.
In terms of other lessons that were kind of learned this season, what have you really heard across the state that were kind of common lessons that were learned and things that producers are going to keep in mind for coming seasons?
Well, I think for the most part, farmers are concentrating now on other field work and what they need to do for those fall crops. And so wheat is kind of, now that it's in the bin, maybe it's to the back of their mind a little bit. And so all we can do is hope that we do get some moisture. I know some places have gotten some moisture in the last month or so, and we really hope that we can, get some additional rainfall and get some winter snowfall and just kind of get out of this extreme drought season that we've been in and have some successful fall crops and successful wheat crop next year.
Absolutely. I know we're about halfway through the summer now at this point, so we still have a bit to go in terms of these warm conditions that we've been experiencing, but also, like you mentioned, these extreme drought conditions that a lot of the state has been experiencing. So hopefully, like you said, in the fall, we'll see a little bit of relief from that.
We could certainly use it all across the state, but especially in those extreme drought areas in western Kansas.
Absolutely. Well, Marsha, thank you so much for your time. Like I said, I know you've been extremely busy in the past month, and now you're kind of playing catch up with some regular things in the office. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for asking me to join you again.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Marsha Boswell. She is the Vice President of Communications at the Kansas Wheat Commission for our final wheat harvest update for the season. We will be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Along with Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. Japanese beetles feed on over 300 species of plants. Recent conditions, warm, sunny weather, have adults feeding on leaves, flowers, and wounded or mushy fruit. Squash bugs are also showing up and need to be treated while they're small. In this week's horticulture segment, K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd discusses how to control Japanese beetles and squash bugs. Raymond, one of the things we're seeing are Japanese beetles.
Yeah, Jeff, the adults are out feeding on just about everything that they find to their taste. Virginia creeper, they feed on roses, obviously. Tilia cordata, lily linden is one of their favorite plants, but they feed on over 300 different plant species. The problem is the way to deal with them. The adults, basically, you have two options. One is spraying, applying an insecticide, or removing by hand. Removing by hand may not be practical because of the number, but the recommendations now are using insecticides, and there are a list of active ingredients, and our most recent newsletter has a listing of these active ingredients. These are mostly pyrethroids, carbaryl 7, and others. The problem with these materials are they're very broad spectrum. They kill everything. And so what can happen is if you spray too often, that is like twice a week or 3 times a week, you can actually stimulate outbreaks of other pests. And what the common ones we run into is two-spotted spider mite, because your sprays will kill the predatory mites that manage those populations. But when you apply these broad-spectrum insecticides, kills the predatory mites and the two-spotted spider mites. Now, have a free-for-all. And so that occurs later in the summertime. However, there are no options other than that. So we recommend if you're going to spray in the morning when the beetles are less active, or in the evening. Avoid spraying in the afternoon when the bees are active, especially honeybees and bumblebees. And if you can do hand removal, that would also help. Because when the Japanese beetle adult feeds on a plant, the plant gives off these we call herbivore-induced volatile compounds that lure more Japanese beetles, and then the Japanese beetle adults also release an aggregation pheromone that attracts others, and the plant just gets overwhelmed. And at that point, there's really not much you can do. You'll just see the typical skeletonized leaves, flowers that have been denuded, and there really isn't much you can do at that point.
Also seeing squash bugs.
Squash bugs are out in force right now. Let me explain this insect. The squash bug overwinters as an adult in debris and leaf litter. So the adults are out right now. They're mating, and now they're laying their famous red eggs on the leaf undersides. Sometimes they'll lay them on the top side of the leaf if it gets too crowded, but they are in full force. I've seen adults. I've seen the fifth instar nymphs, which are the gray ones, and I've seen some substantial damage on some squash plants. You'll see sort of a whiting, silvering appearance. If you look in the leaf, you'll see the nymphs feeding at this point. We'll 1 to maybe 2 generations a year. The issue is that everything's on the leaf underside. So let's go through number 1. You can squish the eggs with your hands, or you can apply like a mineral-based oil to kill the eggs, but it has to come in contact with them. So after that, when the nymphs emerge from the eggs, you can spray or squish them or vacuum them up using some type of physical, mechanical means. And then when the adults are present, that's when it becomes more difficult with an insecticide, because the cuticle or the skin of the insect is very waxy, and the insecticide rolls off of them. So it's either hand-picking or vacuuming. The target stage for, we call the mineral-based oils, is the eggs and the nymphs. We might classify the weak link in the chain in terms of dealing with this insect, squash bug. At the end of the season, be sure to remove all your debris plant material, because that's how they're going to overwinter. You will see nymphs and adults present simultaneously going into like pumpkin season.
Yeah, it is an active time, isn't it?
It is an active time because insects and mites are cold-blooded, so they respond favorably to the temperatures. However, the brutal temperatures we are seeing even slows them down, because they do have an optimum where they says, I'm going to shut her down. This is too hot, just like we're doing, yeah. But right now we have our newsletter. It comes out once a week. We have extension fact sheets. Like I said, we have them on Japanese beetle, squash bug, and bagworms. So we have all this, and we also have extension faculty individuals that can help answer questions regarding not just the insects we've talked about, but there are other insects and mites that are active right now. Two-spotted spider mites feeding on green beans and some other insects too.
That's K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd, with options for controlling Japanese beetles and squash bugs. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.